As they walked together through the thick undergrowth, Kai felt the weight of the silence between them. He didn't know what had happened to her, but he had a feeling he would find out soon enough. He had been in enough situations to know that the truth often came at a price. It wasn't long before they reached the base camp, a temporary shelter set up by the Lunar Recon Unit. As the sun dipped below the alien horizon, the sky painted in hues of violet and amber, Kai activated the shelter's environmental controls. He turned to the woman who was standing silently, her gaze still distant. "Rest for now. I'll prepare something to eat," Kai said, trying to offer some comfort. But as he turned away, he heard a sharp intake of breath. "Do you see them?" she gasped, her body suddenly rigid. Her fingers dug into the moss-covered ground as her amber eyes glazed over, her breath quickening. Kai crouched down beside her, concern flickering in his chest. "What do you see? Who's there?" His hand instinctively hovered near his weapon, but he kept it at his side for the moment, knowing that the woman wasn't dangerous, at least not in the way he had initially assumed. "A laboratory," she whispered, her voice shaking. "The Genesis Collective. Cold, calculating. They saw me as a subject. Subject 47. Aviana." Kai's blood ran cold at the mention of the Genesis Collective. The rumors about them, about their twisted experiments with genetic manipulation, about their attempts to perfect other species, were horrifying. They were known throughout the galaxy as a race of cold, emotionless scientists obsessed with control. But this was something different. He was holding a living being who had been part of their experiments, someone who had been torn apart and discarded. And yet, despite everything she had endured, there was a spark in her. There was humanity in her, something the Genesis Collective had clearly failed to erase. "Aviana," Kai repeated her name softly, testing the waters. He wanted to see if it felt right, if she felt it too. "Is that your name?" She looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "It feels right. Not perfect, but right." Kai nodded. "Then we'll figure it out, Aviana. We'll get you safe." He helped her sit down inside the shelter, noticing how unsteady she was on her feet. "You should rest. We'll figure this out together." As she sat on the sleeping pad, staring out at the alien landscape through the small window, Kai found himself lost in thought. The mission he had come here for, surveying the planet for colonization, suddenly felt meaningless. This wasn't about colonization. This wasn't even about survival. This was about something far greater, something that was beginning to stir deep within him. The sense of connection, of kinship, that had begun to form between him and Aviana, it was undeniable. There was something here, something that had the potential to change everything. He didn't know how or why, but he couldn't ignore it. The encounter, the conversation, it was all just the beginning of something bigger, something that would set the fate of the galaxy on a completely new trajectory. She didn't respond immediately, her lips parted, as if struggling to find the words. Her gaze darted around, looking at everything and nothing all at once. Kai waited, not rushing her, sensing that she was lost in a world of her own memories, or lack thereof. I don't remember," she whispered at last, her voice fragile, almost melodic, yet filled with pain. Her words came out in perfect English, but Kai couldn't help but wonder why she could speak his language so fluently. "You don't remember anything?" Kai asked, leaning in slightly, keeping his tone gentle. "Do you remember where you're from? Who did this to you?" She looked at him, her eyes widening as if trying to process the questions he'd asked. A faint tremor ran through her body as she wrapped her arms around her knees, drawing herself inward. "Pain," she whispered. "Darkness. Then, here. I woke up here." Kai's heart clenched. She spoke as if her mind had been wiped clean, as if she had been taken, tortured, and abandoned without a second thought. His instincts screamed at him to get her back to his base, but there was something deeper at play here. He couldn't just leave her. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his own emotions. "My name's Kai. I'm with the Lunar Recon Unit. You're safe now. I promise." The alien woman, he still didn't know her name, stared at him, a flicker of confusion mixed with distrust crossing her face. "Why would you help me?" she asked, her voice barely audible, tinged with disbelief. Kai was quiet for a moment, thinking carefully. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply, "and no one deserves to be abandoned like this." She searched his face for a long time, her amber eyes intense as though trying to read him, perhaps trying to understand if he was real or if he was yet another cruel illusion. Slowly, her shoulders seemed to relax slightly, as if a weight had been lifted, though faintly. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. Kai didn't know what else to say, so he just nodded. He stood up, offering his hand, his heart racing as he did. There was something about her that pulled at him, something he couldn't yet define. After a brief hesitation, the woman took his hand, and as he helped her to her feet, she swayed slightly, unsteady on her feet. Kai could feel the heat of her hand, and he was struck by how warm she felt, almost feverishly so. Despite her weakness, there was an undeniable strength within her, a quiet force that Kai couldn't ignore. "We need to get you to my base camp," Kai said, his voice firm but reassuring. "It's not far from here." She nodded, still clutching the thermal cloak around herself, her eyes constantly scanning the darkening forest. For the first time since he had found her, Kai saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Not fear, but wariness, a sign that she was starting to come back to herself, starting to remember something, even if she didn't fully understand it. In the vast, uncharted reaches of the galaxy, Kai Donovan, a seasoned ranger from the Lunar Recon Unit, had seen countless worlds, each stranger and more alien than the last. But nothing could have prepared him for what he would encounter on this forsaken planet. It wasn't the towering, violet trees or the eerie bioluminescent creatures that made his pulse quicken. It was the sense that something extraordinary was about to unfold. The alien forest stretched before him like a living labyrinth, its shadows pulsating with a rhythm all their own. Every step Kai took was a careful one, his boots sinking into the thick, soft earth, his rifle at the ready. He had a mission, to scout this untouched planet for potential colonization, but what awaited him in its depths was far beyond the scope of his orders. It was there, beneath the canopy of alien leaves that shimmered like stained glass, that he saw her, a figure, frail and broken, huddled in the twisted roots of an ancient tree. She was unlike anything Kai had ever seen. Her skin had a soft green tint, and her platinum hair cascaded down her back like a waterfall of light. But it wasn't her beauty that caught his attention. It was the sheer vulnerability in her eyes, eyes that spoke of unimaginable pain and loss. She was no human, that much was certain. But what struck Kai even more was the eerie stillness in the air around her, as if the world itself had paused to witness this moment. She had no clothes, no weapons, no hope, just a heartbreaking story etched into her expression. Kai's training kicked in, but even his hardened instincts couldn't prepare him for the wave of emotions that surged through him as he stood frozen in place, watching the alien woman. The forest, which had seemed so alive just moments before, now felt heavy, as if it too was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then, as if sensing his presence, her amber eyes met his, wide, lost, yet filled with an unspoken plea. She trembled slightly, drawing her knees tighter to her chest. The pain in her gaze was palpable, and in that instant, Kai realized that his mission, his very purpose on this strange world, had just changed forever. He didn't know it yet, but the encounter with this broken alien woman would set in motion a chain of events that would alter the course of his life and the fate of an entire galaxy. Kai slowly approached the trembling figure, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. The strange forest seemed to hold its breath as he moved closer, each step measured and deliberate. The woman, this alien being, was looking up at him, her amber eyes reflecting a depth of sorrow and confusion that sent a shiver down his spine. Her skin shimmered faintly under the alien light, a soft green hue that marked her as something otherworldly. But it was the emptiness in her gaze that haunted him the most. She looked lost, abandoned by everything that was once familiar. He knelt down a few feet away from her, careful not to make any sudden movements. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice steady but soft, trying not to spook her. His military training had taught him that fear could make any creature unpredictable. The air in the shelter was thick with the hum of the environmental systems, but it couldn't drown out the feeling that everything had changed in the blink of an eye. Kai watched Aviana as she slowly settled on the sleeping pad, her eyes distant, her body still trembling from the weight of her memories. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words, both of them aware that something monumental had shifted, but neither sure of what came next. Kai took a deep breath and tried to focus on the task at hand. "You should eat," he said, forcing his voice to stay steady. "It'll help you regain your strength." Aviana didn't respond immediately, her gaze fixed on the swirling colors of the alien sky outside. Kai moved to prepare a meal in the corner of the shelter, his mind racing. The Genesis Collective. They weren't just a myth, they were real. And they had done this to her. To Aviana. The thought made his blood boil. But as he set up the food, he couldn't help but glance back at her, his eyes lingering on her. She wasn't just some experiment, some victim. There was something about her, something powerful beneath the surface that he hadn't fully understood yet. She turned her head slowly, her amber eyes meeting his. The intensity of her gaze was unsettling. "You're kind," she said softly, her voice carrying a strange reverence. Kai swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. "I'm just doing what anyone would do." Aviana shook her head slightly, her platinum hair shimmering in the low light. "No, you're different. You're warm." Kai chuckled, trying to brush off the comment, but it stung. "You must be delirious, or maybe just not used to being treated with kindness." She frowned, her eyes narrowing as if she were studying him closely. "You, humans," she said, her voice trailing off. "You're so alive. Your emotions are so strong, but not like the ones they tried to build in me. They don't know how to create what you have." The weight of her words hit Kai harder than he expected. The warmth in her voice, the vulnerability. It was as though, in the span of a single conversation, she was not just talking about him, but about all of humanity, about everything he'd ever known. "I don't think they understand emotions at all," Kai muttered, mostly to himself. "They only want control, perfection." Aviana's eyes darkened for a moment, her expression pained. "That's what they wanted from me, perfection. But they never understood. They never understood what makes you strong. They didn't see that it wasn't just my body they were modifying. They were trying to control something deeper, something you can't measure or study, something human." Kai felt a chill run down his spine. This was no ordinary mission anymore. It wasn't about colonizing or exploring anymore. This was about something far more important. Humanity's essence. What made them different? What made them capable of doing the impossible? "Let's not talk about them right now," Kai said, his voice growing firm. "You need to rest." The following days were filled with small moments of revelation. Aviana, despite the trauma she had endured, began to open up more. Her memories, though fragmented, began to surface slowly. She would stare out at the alien landscape, her eyes unfocused, and Kai would wait, patient, until she spoke again. "I remember a lab," she said one morning, as they sat by the shelter's small fire. "A cold place. I was subject Aviana. They tried to change me, to make me perfect, to make me what they needed me to be. But they didn't understand. They didn't know what it meant to feel." Kai was silent for a moment. The weight of her words hung between them, heavy with unspoken implications. "Who were they?" he asked gently. "The Genesis Collective," she replied, her voice hardening as if she were reliving the pain all over again. "A race of scientists obsessed with control. They saw me as nothing more than an experiment, a project to be perfected and tested. But they were wrong. They couldn't control me. Not in the way they thought." Kai's mind raced. The Genesis Collective's obsession with creating the perfect being wasn't something new to him. He'd heard the rumors, stories of their cold, calculated methods of experimentation, their unrelenting desire for perfection. But hearing it from her, from someone who had lived through it, brought it to a terrifying new reality. Aviana's voice softened as she continued. "They wanted to strip away what made me different. They wanted to erase my past, my memories. They wanted me to be an ideal subject, something they could control. But no matter what they did, they could never take away what I was, what you are." Kai watched her closely, his heart pounding in his chest. Her words were like a revelation. She wasn't just a victim of the Genesis Collective's twisted experiments. She was a survivor, a living and breathing testament to everything that made humanity and herself strong. "I'm sorry," Kai said quietly, his throat tight. I didn't know. I didn't know what you'd been through." She gave him a faint smile, though it was tinged with sadness. "You don't have to apologize. They did what they could to break me, but they couldn't. They couldn't break what made me, me. And in that moment, Kai understood. He understood why the Genesis Collective's attempts to manipulate her had failed. They had tried to control the very thing that made her, and humanity, indomitable. Emotion. The very thing they had tried to strip away. Kai and Aviana fell into a deep, comfortable silence, the crackle of the fire filling the air. But as he watched the flames dance in the night, something deep inside him shifted. He knew that whatever happened next, whatever revelations came, he would not back down. He had to protect her. They had to stop the Genesis Collective before they could do this to anyone else. It was 2 days later when the first signs of trouble appeared. The air around them suddenly grew thick with tension, as if the planet itself had sensed the impending danger. Kai was checking the perimeter sensors when a sharp, mechanical sound filled the air. His pulse immediately quickened. "Get inside," he ordered Aviana, his voice urgent. She didn't need to be told twice. Her eyes had already narrowed, her body stiffening with the same instinctive alertness that had kept her alive through the hell the Genesis Collective had subjected her to. The first explosion rocked the shelter, sending Kai and Aviana stumbling. The walls shuddered as another shockwave hit, followed by a strange shimmering mist that filled the air. Kai cursed under his breath as he scrambled for his armor. "Stay close," he told Aviana, moving swiftly as he suited up. His military training kicked in, his movements mechanical and precise, but his mind was still focused on the alien woman at his side. She was still fragile, but there was something about her that made him believe they could survive this together. The ASTRO hunters, Genesis's elite forces, were closing in, and this time they wouldn't stop until they had Aviana back. Kai's heart pounded in his chest. He was ready. He had to be. The day after the attack, the tension in the air was palpable. Despite the danger they had narrowly escaped, Aviana's presence beside Kai felt different now, charged, almost electric. As they sat together in the aftermath of the explosion, both of them recovering from the physical shock, an unspoken connection between them seemed to grow stronger. The events of the past few days had irrevocably changed both of them, and neither was sure where it would lead. Kai glanced at her, noticing that she seemed more alert than before, more focused. Her amber eyes were clearer, more determined, though there was still a hint of pain lingering in them. It was as if the trauma had peeled away layers of her being, exposing something far deeper, something even more powerful than before. "I'm starting to remember more," Aviana said suddenly, breaking the silence. Her voice was steady, though there was an underlying sadness. "Fragments. Pieces of who I was before they took me." Kai leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "What do you remember?" She hesitated, her eyes flickering as if chasing memories through a fog. "I remember the lab, the coldness, the sterile white walls. But there's more. I remember them talking about me like I was an object, an experiment. They called me Subject 47. I was meant to be perfect, a perfect weapon, but they never understood what makes someone truly strong." Kai's brow furrowed. He didn't need to hear more to understand the cruelty of the Genesis Collective's methods. They saw beings like Aviana not as individuals, but as projects, tools to be manipulated and controlled. He could feel the anger building inside him again, anger at what had been done to her and to countless others. "Don't let them take away what you are," Kai said, his voice low but firm. "You're more than just a subject. You're alive, and that's something they can't take from you." Aviana met his gaze, and for the first time, a small flicker of hope crossed her face. "They tried to break me," she said softly, "but they couldn't. They couldn't strip away what makes me me." The simple truth of her words hit Kai harder than he expected. Aviana's strength wasn't just physical. It was something deeper, something that the Genesis Collective had failed to understand, failed to replicate. It was the human ability to feel, to connect, to choose. And in that moment, he realized something profound. Emotions weren't weaknesses. They were power, and that was the power he had seen in her all along. The night after their conversation, the shadows seemed to grow darker, more oppressive. The quiet was broken by the distant hum of engines, the unmistakable sound of approaching spacecraft. Kai's heart raced. It wasn't just the Genesis Collective seekers. This time it was their elite force, the Sentinels. "The Sentinels are here," Kai said urgently, looking at Aviana, who had already moved to the weapons locker, her movements fluid and precise. They're the best of the best, enhanced, like you, emotionless, relentless. Aviana nodded, her face set in grim determination. I know. They've been trained to hunt. They'll come for me. They won't stop until they have me back. Kai was about to say something else, but Aviana beat him to it. We need to fight back. We can't run anymore. Her voice was steady, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of fear, perhaps, but it was swallowed by a deep, unwavering resolve. She was ready to face whatever came next. Kai could see it in her eyes. She wasn't just going to survive. She was going to fight. Without another word, Kai strapped on his armor, checking his rifle. He glanced at her, noticing the subtle changes in her, the faint shimmer of her skin in the dim light, the way her eyes now seemed sharper, more aware, more alive. Are you ready? He asked, his voice low, his pulse quickening. Aviana gave him a brief, tight smile. I was ready the moment I was taken. They moved quickly, preparing for the inevitable assault. The sound of approaching engines grew louder, signaling the Sentinel's descent. Kai didn't know how long they could hold out, but he wasn't about to go down without a fight. Not when he had Aviana by his side. The battle came swiftly. The Sentinels, cloaked and near impossible to track with the human eye, descended onto the base camp with terrifying precision. The first explosion sent Kai and Aviana diving for cover. As Kai activated his helmet's targeting system, he could see the faint outlines of the Sentinels through the cloak of invisibility they wore, their glowing red eyes piercing through the darkness. Aviana moved with the grace of a predator, her enhanced abilities giving her a terrifying speed and agility. She fired with pinpoint accuracy, dropping one Sentinel after another in swift succession. The Sentinels, though more powerful than anything Kai had fought before, were no match for her fluid movements, her unpredictability. They don't understand, Aviana shouted over the chaos of battle. They think emotions are weaknesses. But they're wrong. This is what makes us unstoppable. Kai's pulse pounded in his ears as he returned fire, his rifle blasting through the air in sharp bursts. The Sentinels faltered for a split second, their mechanical minds unable to adapt to the human unpredictability that was driving both him and Aviana. Aviana's movements were like a dance, a deadly, beautiful choreography that left the Sentinels no room to strike. Every shot was precise, every dodge effortless. But it wasn't just her enhancements. It was something more, something deeply human, that made her invincible. Kai had heard of the Sentinels' reputation, cold, calculating, unbeatable. But they had never encountered this. Human emotion, human spirit. Aviana's love for life, her desire to protect herself and Kai, fueled her in ways that no machine could comprehend. The battle raged on, but as more Sentinels fell, the remaining ones hesitated. They couldn't understand the force they were up against. Finally, Kai dropped the last of them with a well-placed shot. The clearing was quiet once more, save for the distant hum of the retreating spacecraft. Aviana stood in the center of the battlefield, breathing heavily but unharmed. Her body shimmered faintly in the afterglow of the fight, a reminder of her enhanced abilities. But there was something different about her now. Her eyes were alive, full of strength, full of power. She turned to Kai, a small smile tugging at her lips. I told you, we can't be controlled. Kai approached her, his heart still racing, but a sense of awe filling him. You're not just a survivor, you're a warrior. Aviana's smile softened. No, I'm human. And for the first time, Kai truly understood. What had started as a mission to explore and conquer a new world had transformed into something far more profound. The fight they had just won wasn't just for survival. It was a fight for freedom. Freedom from those who sought to strip away the very essence of life, of emotion, of connection. And together, Kai and Aviana had proven that they were stronger than anything the Genesis Collective could throw at them. After the chaos of the battle subsided, the silence that followed felt almost unnatural. The eerie hum of the retreating Sentinels' cloaking technology faded into the distance, leaving only the rustle of the alien trees and the soft crackle of their shelter's remaining lights. Kai and Aviana stood together amidst the wreckage of their enemies, their breathing heavy but synchronized, as if the fight had bonded them in ways they hadn't fully realized yet. Kai stepped forward, checking the perimeter once more, ensuring there were no hidden threats left. His mind was still racing with adrenaline, but underneath it, something far deeper stirred. He had seen the power Aviana wielded, both her enhanced abilities and the raw, human emotion that fueled them. It was as if she had tapped into a force beyond physical strength, something that made her unbreakable, unstoppable. Turning to her, Kai felt an overwhelming sense of awe. You did that, he said, his voice laced with admiration. You took them all down, one by one. Aviana met his gaze, her eyes shimmering in the dim light. I didn't do it alone, she replied softly. You were there with me. We fought together. Kai swallowed hard, realizing that what she said wasn't just about the fight. It was about everything they had shared. Everything that had brought them to this moment. Their bond was more than physical. It was emotional, visceral. It was human. As the moments passed, Kai started to feel something shift within him, a pull toward Aviana that went beyond the need for survival. It was something deeper, a desire to protect, to understand, and to share in whatever came next. He had been trained to stay focused on the mission, to keep his emotions in check. But with Aviana, it felt impossible to ignore what was growing between them. Before he could speak again, Aviana stepped forward, her voice quieter than before. I remember more now, she said, her eyes distant. About them, about what they did to me. Kai's heart tightened. What do you mean? You don't have to talk about it if it's too much. But she shook her head, her gaze sharpening. No, I need to. I have to. There's something important I need to tell you. Kai nodded, sensing that this moment, this revelation, would be a turning point, not just in their fight against the Genesis Collective, but in their understanding of who Aviana was and what she had become. I'm listening. Aviana inhaled deeply, gathering herself. They didn't just modify me genetically. They tried to suppress something human inside me. They tried to erase my emotions, to control them, to make me a weapon that would do what they wanted without hesitation. They believed that if they could control my emotions, they could control everything about me. Kai's fists clenched, his anger flaring once more at the thought of what she had been subjected to. That's monstrous, he muttered. Aviana gave him a faint smile, her lips curling with a strange, knowing sadness. It was, but it wasn't just me. They did it to everyone they captured, every test subject, every being they experimented on. The same thing. They stripped us of our emotions, our humanity, trying to build the perfect soldier. But they couldn't create the one thing that would have made us invincible. Kai's brow furrowed. What was that? The will to choose, she said softly. They couldn't take away my ability to choose what I wanted. They couldn't control my heart. And that's why they failed. They didn't understand that true strength, true power, doesn't come from control or perfection. It comes from being able to choose your own path, to feed to love. Kai's heart skipped a beat. Her words struck him deeply. Everything he had learned, everything he had been taught, had focused on control, on precision, on strategy. But here in front of him was the truth he had never fully realized. His emotions, his ability to care, to love, to make decisions in the face of impossible odds, that was his greatest strength. And it was her strength, too. The moment stretched out between them, the world outside the shelter seeming to hold its breath. They were no longer just two beings caught in the chaos of a war between species. They were two souls who had discovered something bigger, something that had the power to change everything. Aviana took a step closer to him, her eyes locking with his, as if she were searching for something in his gaze. Do you understand? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Kai didn't have to think. He didn't have to question. He knew. I understand, he said, his voice thick with emotion. And I'm with you no matter what happens. In that moment, something shifted within them. It wasn't just a promise. It was a shared understanding of what lay ahead. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for freedom. Freedom to feel, to choose, and to change the galaxy in a way the Genesis Collective could never imagine. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. Kai and Aviana knew the battle was far from over. The Genesis Collective had sent its elite forces after her once. They would come again, and next time it might be even worse. But this time, Aviana wasn't the fragile experiment they had once tried to break. She was stronger, more focused, and, most importantly, She had something the Genesis Collective could never control: her humanity. Kai and Aviana spent the following hours strategizing, training, and building defenses around their shelter. Every minute they spent together, every plan they crafted, seemed to deepen the bond between them. They worked seamlessly together, their movements fluid, as though they had known each other far longer than just a few days. One evening, as the two of them sat atop a small rise overlooking the alien forest, Kai spoke up. "I know we have to stop the Genesis Collective," he said, his voice distant, yet filled with determination. "But there's something else. I can't just leave this planet, not like this." Aviana turned to him, her expression softening. "What do you mean?" Kai met her gaze, his jaw tightening. "This planet, this place, it's not just about you, it's about us, about what we can become together. If we fight back, if we show the galaxy what we're capable of, we could change everything. This isn't just about taking down an enemy. No, this is about showing that humanity's greatest strength isn't in our weapons or our technology. It's in what we can feel and how we can connect." Aviana smiled, the faintest trace of emotion flickering across her face. "Then let's show them, together." The days following their conversation were tense. Kai and Aviana knew that the Genesis Collective was not one to back down. If anything, their previous attempts at capturing Aviana would only fuel their desire to reclaim their failed experiment and attempt to perfect their methods. As much as Kai and Aviana had hoped for some semblance of peace, they knew that it would be fleeting. The Genesis Collective would return, stronger, smarter, and more determined. They spent their days preparing, reinforcing their shelter, and learning more about each other. It wasn't just about the fight anymore. It was about understanding the true cost of the war they were in, and what they both stood to lose if they failed. Every conversation felt more intimate, every shared moment a step closer to something greater than just survival. But even as they trained and strategized, Kai couldn't shake the feeling that their battle wasn't just against the Genesis Collective. It was a war for something far more profound, a war for humanity's essence, the very thing that had been overlooked, suppressed, and discarded by so many others. It was their heart, their emotions, their drive to connect. That was the power that had been denied to Aviana and countless others, and it was this power that now flowed through her, making her stronger than any weapon the Genesis Collective could create. One night, as the stars twinkled above them and the soft hum of their shelter systems buzzed in the background, Aviana and Kai sat together by the fire. They didn't speak much, both lost in their thoughts. But the weight of what was coming, the inevitability of the final confrontation, hung between them like a storm cloud. "We need to be ready," Kai said after a long silence, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "We can't afford to underestimate them. They'll come back with everything they have." Aviana nodded, her amber eyes flickering in the firelight. "I know. And this time, we can't just fight them. We have to show them what they've missed, show them the power of choice, the power of what it means to feel." Kai turned to her, surprised by the sudden intensity in her voice. "What do you mean?" She met his gaze, her expression unyielding, as if she had reached a profound understanding about herself, about their fight. "We've been fighting them physically, but their greatest weapon isn't their soldiers or their technology. It's their belief that emotions are weaknesses. If we're going to win this, we need to change their minds. We need to show them what they don't understand." Kai was silent for a moment, letting her words sink in. She was right. The Genesis Collective had been obsessed with perfecting life, manipulating and controlling genetic material, and stripping away what made people vulnerable, what made them human. They believed that emotion, connection, and love were primitive, messy, and beneath them. But Aviana had proven that these things were not weaknesses. They were the very things that made people strong. "Are you saying we need to make them feel?" Kai asked, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Aviana's lips curved into a soft, knowing smile. "Exactly. If they can't control their emotions, they'll be just like us. And when they understand that, when they see that emotions are what make us truly unstoppable, they'll know what true power really is." Kai stood up, a renewed sense of purpose flooding through him. "All right, we fight to win, not just to survive. We show them what we're made of. The next few days passed in a blur of action. Kai and Aviana gathered all the data they could, making plans, gathering resources, and reinforcing their defenses. The sense of urgency was palpable. They knew the Genesis Collective would return with a vengeance, but they also knew that they had something far stronger than technology on their side. They had the ability to connect, to fight for what they believed in, to choose. On the eve of the final confrontation, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Aviana and Kai stood on a small rise overlooking the valley. The atmosphere was heavy, filled with the weight of what was to come. But despite the danger, despite the fear that gnawed at the back of his mind, Kai felt something he hadn't felt before. Hope. It wasn't just the hope of winning the battle, but the hope of showing the galaxy, showing the Genesis Collective, that humanity's greatest strength lay in its ability to feel, to love, and to fight for what was worth protecting. Aviana stood beside him, her presence calming but powerful. Her enhanced form, coupled with her growing emotional strength, made her an unstoppable force. But it was more than just her abilities. It was her resolve, her understanding of what they were fighting for, that made her a beacon of light in the darkness. "You ready for this?" Kai asked, his voice low but steady. Aviana turned to him, her eyes reflecting the light of the stars. "I've been ready my whole life." They didn't need to say anything else. They knew what they had to do. The final battle was upon them. As the Genesis Collective ships appeared on the horizon, cloaked in their signature technology, Kai and Aviana moved swiftly to their positions. The Sentinels, faster, stronger, and more dangerous than any soldiers they had faced, began to descend from the sky, their weapons raised and ready. The battle was inevitable, but this time, it wasn't just about firepower. Aviana and Kai took their places, standing side by side as the first wave of Sentinels approached. There was no fear in Aviana's eyes, only the certainty of what she had come to understand. Kai's hand tightened on his rifle, but he could feel something else inside him. His heart was racing, but it wasn't fear. It was purpose. As the Sentinels landed, they immediately began to advance, their eyes glowing with the cold, emotionless focus that the Genesis Collective had implanted in them. But as the first shots were fired, something unexpected happened. The Sentinels faltered. They hesitated. For the first time, they were faced with something they couldn't predict, something they couldn't understand. Aviana was at the forefront, moving with a fluid grace that made her appear almost ethereal. She fired, but it wasn't just the precision of her shots that took down the Sentinels. It was the sheer force of her will, the strength of her emotions that made her invincible. As she moved, every step seemed to echo the power of her connection with Kai, with humanity, and with herself. Kai moved beside her, providing cover and support, but he could see it in her eyes. The Genesis Collective had underestimated what it meant to be human. They had thought they could control everything, thought they could manipulate life itself. But in that moment, they learned the hardest lesson of all. You can't control what you don't understand. The battle raged on, but Kai and Aviana fought not just with weapons, but with their hearts. The Sentinels, once unstoppable, began to break. Their mechanical minds couldn't fathom the force that was driving Kai and Aviana. And as the last of the Sentinels fell, the silence that followed was deafening. Kai and Aviana stood together, panting but triumphant, the battlefield around them littered with the remains of their enemies. But in that moment, they knew something profound had changed. This wasn't just a victory over the Genesis Collective. It was a victory over everything they had stood for, over the idea that control, manipulation, and perfection were the ultimate goals. What had been lost to them, what they had been trying to perfect, had been with Kai and Aviana all along, the power of connection. The echo of battle had faded, and the alien forest once again seemed to breathe in the stillness of the night. The air was thick with dust and the remnants of the fight that had just unfolded. Kai and Aviana stood in the heart of the battlefield, surrounded by the wreckage of the Genesis Collective's elite forces, the Sentinels. Their bodies lay in twisted, broken heaps, their cold, emotionless forms shattered by the very force they had sought to suppress, human emotion. Kai looked over at Aviana, his heart still racing from the adrenaline of the battle, but there was something else in his chest now, a warmth, a sense of profound peace. He had been fighting his whole life, fighting to survive, fighting for a cause. But in this moment, he realized that the fight had never really been about survival. It had been about something far more significant: freedom, the freedom to feel, the freedom to choose. "You did it," Kai said, his voice thick with awe. "We did it." Aviana stood, her figure illuminated by the faint bioluminescent glow of the surrounding alien flora. Her platinum hair shimmered in the night, and her skin seemed to glow with a soft, ethereal light. There was something powerful about her, something undeniable. But it wasn't just her enhanced abilities. It was her strength of will, her ability to embrace her humanity, that made her so formidable. Aviana turned to him, her amber eyes meeting his. "We're not just survivors anymore, Kai. We're something more. We're proof that emotions are not a weakness, but our greatest strength." Kai felt the weight of her words settle into his chest. It wasn't just the end of the battle. It was the beginning of something entirely new, something that could change the fate of the galaxy itself. As they made their way back to the shelter, the peaceful silence around them felt like a brief respite before the storm. Kai knew that this victory wasn't the end. The Genesis Collective would regroup, recover, and they would come again. But this time, they weren't just facing an unstoppable force. They were facing something far more dangerous: an idea. An idea that emotions, love, and connection were more powerful than any technology, any weapon, or any amount of genetic modification. Kai and Aviana set up a new strategy. This time, they would take the fight to the Genesis Collective. They wouldn't wait for the next attack. They would go after them, expose their weaknesses, and show the galaxy what it meant to truly feel. They had a mission now, not just to survive, but to change everything. Kai sent out a signal to the other human outposts, to those who would listen, those who might understand. He had no idea if it would reach them, but he had to try. The message was simple: humanity's greatest strength is not in perfection or control. It's in our ability to feel, to love, and to choose. The response wasn't immediate, but as the days passed, more ships came into view. At first, it was just a handful of scout ships. Then larger fleets began to arrive. The news of their victory, their message, had spread throughout the galaxy. The Genesis Collective stranglehold was beginning to weaken. What started as a small, isolated battle had grown into something much larger. A revolution had begun. The first human fleet to arrive was led by a commander, a woman named Captain Lyra Vega, who had heard the broadcast and knew that Kai's message was not just a plea for survival, it was a call to arms. As her ship landed near the shelter, she disembarked, flanked by her crew. The tension in the air was thick as she approached, but there was a glimmer of hope in her eyes, a recognition of something important, something revolutionary. Kai greeted her with a firm handshake, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "We've been fighting alone for so long," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But this changes everything." Captain Vega smiled, the pride in her expression clear. "It's not just you, Kai. You've given us something to fight for, something that the Genesis Collective couldn't ever comprehend. Hope, choice, freedom." Aviana stepped forward, her presence commanding as always, but there was a softness to her now, a quiet strength that radiated from her. "This isn't just about us anymore," she said, her voice unwavering. "This is about all of us, all the beings who have been experimented on, controlled, or manipulated. It's about our right to choose, to feel, and to exist on our own terms." Captain Vega nodded, her expression hardening as the realization of what they had accomplished hit her. "Then let's finish this. We'll make sure the Genesis Collective knows that the galaxy isn't theirs to control. We're going to take it back." The Genesis Collective's response to the growing resistance was swift, but it was no longer the cold, calculated retaliation they had once been known for. The Collective's leadership, cold and unfeeling, had begun to fracture. The very idea of human emotions, something they had deemed primitive and inferior, was now their greatest weakness. The forces they sent to suppress the revolution were quickly overwhelmed, their efficiency disrupted by the sheer unpredictability of their opponents. Kai, Aviana, and the growing human fleet struck decisively, infiltrating the Genesis Collective strongholds and liberating other test subjects, other beings who had been subjected to their cruel experiments. They didn't just defeat their enemies, they showed them the power of choice, the strength in connection, and the undeniable force of love. With every battle they won, the Genesis Collective's perfect structure began to crumble. The belief that emotion was weakness slowly started to unravel. The final confrontation was inevitable. It took place on a remote planet, hidden deep within the Genesis Collective's territory. The battle was fierce, but this time, Kai and Aviana fought not just to win. They fought to prove that true power comes from embracing the deepest parts of themselves, from choosing to fight for the things that matter. They were no longer pawns in a game. They were the game changers. When the battle was finally over, when the last of the Genesis Collective's leaders had been defeated, Kai and Aviana stood together, gazing out at the wreckage of their enemies. The war was over. The battle for control of the galaxy had been won, not through force, but through the most powerful weapon they had, their emotions. Their ability to feel, to love, and to choose had overcome everything the Genesis Collective had believed in. With the fall of the Genesis Collective, the galaxy began to heal. The planets that had been controlled and experimented on by the cold, emotionless scientists were freed. New alliances were forged, not through politics or strategy, but through understanding, empathy, and shared values. Kai and Aviana became symbols of this new era. Their bond, once formed in the midst of chaos, became a beacon of hope for the galaxy. They had shown that emotions were not weaknesses. They were the most powerful force in the universe. Aviana, once known only as a subject, now stood tall as a leader, not just of the human resistance, but as a symbol of the power of human connection. Kai, who had once fought for survival, now fought for a future where no being, human or alien, would be denied the right to choose their own path. As they stood side by side, watching the stars shimmer in the distance, they knew their journey was far from over. The galaxy had been changed, and with it, everything they had fought for. But as they looked ahead, they knew that their greatest challenge was not the enemies they had defeated, but the responsibility that they now carried. Together, they had proved that love, connection, and the ability to feel were not just the essence of humanity. They were the essence of the galaxy itself.